Good afternoon and welcome to the Queensland Media Club. My name is Rachel Riga and I'm a state political reporter for ABC News Queensland. I'm also the Vice President of the Queensland Parliamentary Press Gallery. Thank you for joining us for this highly anticipated and highly publicised event, which was cancelled and rescheduled from last year. Of course, over that time, we now have a new Premier. The address by Stephen Miles today will mark the first time a Queensland Premier has spoken at the Queensland Media Club in this term of Parliament. The last time this occurred was during a leaders' debate in the lead up to the 2020 state election. So, let's get underway. Premier Miles was sworn in as the 40th Premier of Queensland on the 15th of December last year. He grew up in Brisbane, the son of a Golden Circle cannery fitter and workplace health and safety inspector. Premier Miles says his commitment to standing up for the rights of working people motivated him to run for Parliament. He was first elected as the member for Murrumba at the 2015 state election. In the first Palaszczuk ministry, he served as Minister for Environment and Heritage Protection and Minister for National Parks and the Great Barrier Reef. Premier Miles was sworn in as Health Minister in 2017 and later Deputy Premier in 2020. As the former Health Minister, he led the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic alongside Queensland's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Jeanette Young. This year, the Premier has made it a priority to create opportunity for all Queenslanders now and into the future. He plans on supporting the industries Queensland was built on and investing in emerging industries to create new jobs powered by renewable energy and hydrogen. Premier Miles and his wife Kim are raising their 3 children in the Moreton Bay region suburb of Mango Hill. Please welcome the Queensland Premier, Stephen Miles.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I join Peter in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're gathered on and pay my respects to their elders and certainly to any First Nations people who've joined us today. Can I also acknowledge my colleagues for coming along, the Deputy Premier and a bunch of ministers. I didn't tell them they had to, so the fact that they are here, I'm very grateful. It's been just 2 months since I became Queensland's new Premier, and it feels like longer. On that first day, I said I would deliver a fresh approach to the challenges that we face and the opportunities that we have. I said I would work every single day for Queenslanders. I started with cost of living measures, like freezing the cost of rego and public transport, delivering homes for vulnerable Queenslanders, and my first funding decision, getting a police helicopter for Townsville. We've done a lot in just 2 months. All Queenslanders have. In just that time, Queenslanders have faced 3 natural disasters: Tropical Cyclone Jasper and the subsequent flooding event, the South East Queensland storms on Christmas night, and Tropical Cyclone Kirrily, with its impacts on Townsville, Western Queensland and Moreton Bay. And together, we've handled them with the same strength and courage that Queenslanders are known for. Queenslanders like Bill, who with his wife climbed onto their roof and then into a tree and tied themselves to a branch as the floodwaters rushed through Dagara. Billy got one of the first caravans we delivered to Ayton. Queenslanders like Danny, who lost his house in the flood, but also got bitten by a 4-metre crocodile that ate his dog earlier in the year. He apologised for getting worked up, as he said he'd had a bad year. Queenslanders like Tammy, a nurse at the Gold Coast University Hospital whose house was in the hardest hit part of the Gold Coast on Christmas night. She was on shift at the hospital while the storm smashed her place. Queenslanders like Miles here, who was trapped for weeks with the whole town of Cape Tribulation. But that didn't dull his smile, and he wanted to meet me because we have the same name. And all the Queenslanders who rushed to support people affected by these natural disasters. All those volunteers and public servants, council workers and defence personnel, they did us so proud. That's what our communities expect of each other, and it's what they expect of us. In between disasters, we've been working hard to address the things Queenslanders are concerned about. When I first spoke to Queenslanders as Premier, I said the most important thing a government can do is deliver intergenerational prosperity. That's just shorthand for saying that government should help parents to give their kids more opportunity than they had. Good, secure, affordable housing is the most important foundation to making that happen. No matter how hard they work, it's next to impossible for parents to give their kids those opportunities if they're constantly moving house, changing school, or worse still, couch surfing or sleeping rough. Labor governments are about opportunity, and there is no opportunity without housing. It doesn't matter how good the school is. If a student is worried about where they'll sleep that night, they aren't going to learn. They will probably fall behind and start misbehaving. When a family has to keep moving because the rent's constantly going up, we're not giving young Queenslanders the best start in life. Secure housing played a crucial role in my journey. When I think about the 3 generations of my family, I can see I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for housing and the kinds of housing policies that Labor governments deliver. Not a lot of people know it, but my mother's family experienced homelessness. My nan and pop spent much of their life in Housing Commission. We had Christmas lunch with our cousins every year in this Housing Commission house in Tagum. I'm the one with the retro Triple J jersey on. It wasn't retro then. On my dad's side, my grandma and granddad bought a house in Wavell Heights with a 50-year loan the year my dad was born. I was there with my grandma the day she went to the Commonwealth Bank to make the last repayment 50 years later. She was so proud. My own parents scraped together the money to buy a 1/4-acre block in Petrie. It was tough for them. Dad sold his boat and took all the overtime he could get at the cannery. Mum found extra ways to earn money too, like doing flower arrangements for weddings, that kind of thing. Then with a bit of help from their friends, they built their own house on that block. Dad would sleep in the unfinished house so he could get a bit more work done even after a long day on the factory floor. It was one of the first houses in a new estate, and we watched over the years the estate fill with more families a lot like ours. Petrie State School was across the road, an easy walk for my sister and I. The train station was just down the street. There's a university campus now there too, but that's another story for a different speech. When I bought my first house in Alderley, I'd managed to save a deposit, but it wasn't enough to avoid mortgage insurance. Now, I was a lucky one. My parents were able to be guarantor, and that saved me thousands of dollars. I was hugely grateful to them, but also incredibly relieved when the bank said that I could take them off the loan. Now, Kim and I own our place at Mango Hill on a 400-square block, and like where I grew up, it's close to the school and a train station. It's not a fancy mansion, but it's our family home. It's full of memories that are special to us. All Queenslanders deserve the same, somewhere to call home. And making that a little easier is a priority for me and our government. Housing affordability and supply has emerged as a challenge across the world, from high inflation driven by a rebounding global economy after the pandemic, through to the impacts of the invasion of Ukraine and the re-emergence of war in the Middle East. These things have driven up the cost of construction materials everywhere. As part of the response to rising costs, reserve banks have hiked up interest rates. In Australia, we've seen interest rates increase 13 times since May 2022. That's the biggest increase in the shortest period in 40 years. And it's all come at a time when our job market has taken off. Since Labor came to government, our economy has created more jobs on average than at any point since ABS records began. Unemployment has hit the lowest rates on record. The strength of our economy has led to record numbers of people moving to Queensland. 133,000 people moved here from interstate since 2020. That's the largest movement of people within Australia to Queensland since the 1990s. And since international borders reopened, 115,000 people have moved here from overseas, the biggest movement since the ABS started keeping records. We can all be proud of creating a place that's so attractive, somewhere that people want to be, but that appeal brings challenges too. Unlike previous periods of mass migration, many of the people moving here are moving here to study or are already university educated. So they're not the kinds of people that will pick up the tools to help us build houses. Across the country, there is now a shortage of full-time construction workers. It's an issue that I've raised with the Prime Minister, and I know he's keen to work with us on. Queensland's population has grown by 330,000 people since 2020. That's the equivalent to adding another Townsville and Rockhampton to our state in just 3.5 years. All these people need access not just to housing, but to hospitals, roads, energy infrastructure, transport and schools as well. That's why we're delivering Queensland's Big Build, delivering the largest infrastructure program in Queensland's history. The rate of new homes has increased since 2015 by 1,895 per quarter. Over 333,000 homes, new homes, have been built in that time. And yet, despite this, houses have not been built fast enough to keep up with the record number of people moving here. All the global conditions I've outlined are impacting on our lives because Queenslanders are struggling with higher rents and struggling to find the high amounts needed to put a deposit on a house. Like the 1 in 3 Queenslanders who are renting, or the Queenslanders who are competing with vacancy rates below 1% in many parts of the state. The Queenslanders who own a home but are battling higher interest rates. I want every Queenslander to know that I'm listening, that I get it, and that I'm on their side. There are too many Queensland kids without access to a home. That there are children sleeping in cars is heartbreaking. I've seen kids getting dressed into their school uniforms at the local shopping centre. Recently, we heard about families living in sheds without any running water. And just a few blocks from here, there are tents on the banks of the Brisbane River. Providing the help needed is complex. My government's priority is to offer every Queenslander safe shelter. Last financial year, over 200,000 Queenslanders were offered homelessness support, and yet that hasn't been enough. That's why we need the Homes for Queenslanders plan. One of my first decisions as Premier was to appoint a dedicated Minister for Housing, Local Government, Planning and Public Works. This is a housing mega portfolio with all the levers that the state can pull to deliver more houses in both the social sector and, importantly, in the private market. Today I'm announcing how our government will make Homes for Queenslanders a priority. The $3.1 billion investment I'm announcing today in Homes for Queenslanders is the single largest investment in Queensland's housing system by a government ever. It is a comprehensive plan to build more homes faster, to support renters, to help first homeowners, to boost our social housing big build, and to work towards an end to homelessness. This record financial investment is significant, but the mechanisms for delivering it are too. To ensure Homes for Queenslanders delivers, I've asked Minister Scanlon to refocus the Housing Roundtable to an implementation task force of key stakeholders who will help us to achieve a better housing system. Because good governments partner with the right expertise. Our plan to build more homes faster starts with a target to deliver 1 million new homes by 2046. 95% of those homes will need to be in the private housing market. And that's why we will fund the trunk infrastructure to encourage more development. We will start by progressing 3 new sites at Varsity Lakes, Mango Hill and Pimlico with leases of public land to developers to support new housing projects. Our government understands the enormous pressure that many Queensland renters are under. Under our Homes for Queenslanders plan, we are delivering a priority relief package for Queensland renters to support more people to stay in the private market and out of the social housing system, funding things like bond loans, portable bonds, and banning rent bidding. And we will increase the duration of the rental security subsidy for all households and even more for people under 25. On Sunday, I met Caroline, who talked to me about how tough it is to find a place to rent. She said it wasn't uncommon to have to join a queue that went round the block to inspect an apartment. And even if you get approved, you've still got to find the money for the bond. Well, we were able to help Caroline out with a bond loan, and that helped her secure a property and meant she could afford her moving costs. To support first homeowners, we have doubled the first homeowners grant to $30,000, which is now the highest in mainland Australia. Under our Homes for Queenslanders plan, we are going further with a Queensland Home Finance Loan Pilot, supporting Queenslanders living in regional locations to buy a house. We will also do more to support First Nations people into home ownership. And we will back the federal government's Help to Buy scheme by introducing the necessary legislation into the Queensland Parliament this year. Housing shouldn't be a political football. I will do everything I can as Premier to seek bipartisan support in Queensland for this initiative, because unfortunately we haven't seen that kind of bipartisan support at a national level. Investment in social housing across Australia has not kept up with demand. In 1981, social housing was 4.9% of housing stock. In 2021, that figure had fallen to 3.8%. Today, I am making a clear commitment that our government will step up and deliver a safe place to live for Queenslanders doing it tough. We will restore social housing to where it needs to be as a percentage of the total housing stock, with a target of 53,500 social homes by 2046. The largest investment in social houses in the history of Queensland. We will work with the federal government to deliver on their national housing plan, and again, we call for bipartisan support for that plan in Queensland too. One of the first things I did as Premier was to visit the tents at Musgrave Park. No one should have to live like that. While I was there, I met Munya, who was just so excited because he knew that the next day he was moving into a social house. He's at Annalee, he's invited us to the housewarming. Our Homes for Queenslanders plan sets a clear target to end homelessness. Queenslanders I talk to expect nothing less than that. That's why we're delivering a record 20% uplift to homelessness services, starting with an expansion to the inner city Brisbane critical response team to all regions from this month. Dedicated teams will work on the ground with people who are experiencing homelessness and work alongside specialist homelessness services. My goal is to have offered shelter to every single Queenslander sleeping rough. I understand the importance of having a place to call home. Having our own home gave me and my family security, stability, and a sense of pride. Kids growing up in Queensland today should have the same opportunity as I did to buy a house. I will continue to work hard every day for Queenslanders to make this a reality. Thank you for joining me for the lunch.
Joining the Premier on stage to take questions is Meaghan Scanlon, Minister for Housing, Local Government and Planning and Minister for Public Works. Please welcome Minister Scanlon.
Meaghan's here for the detailed questions.
Is she here to take all the hard questions?
Yes.
So, Premier, we'll start. In your speech, you mentioned you were in discussions with the Prime Minister to address the shortage of full-time construction workers. Can you talk us through exactly what you're discussing and what solutions might be possible there?
So what we've asked them to consider is prioritising or fast-tracking visas for construction workers, people with construction skills. The fact is, we've seen a massive surge in migration nationally, and all of those people need homes as well as all the other infrastructure that we're building. It makes sense to prioritise those who can help us build those homes, and so that's what we've asked of the Australian government. Of course, there might be other things that we can do, but we think that's an early initiative that could help.
You've set that really ambitious goal to reach 1 million new properties built by 2046, largely in the private sector. What are you going to do on a state level to enable that to happen, given we do have labour shortages, material shortages, and all those national and international issues?
We've created a team in Meaghan's department that will work with developers to unlock development opportunities. Where the impediment to those developments is financial viability. What we've heard from them is that sometimes subsidising their infrastructure charges could mean the difference between construction going ahead and not going ahead. So one of the biggest funds in the plan is really there so that when we identify a developer and a development that is in the right location and will deliver the right kind of stock, so affordable stock with some share of social housing, we'll pay some or all of the infrastructure charges for that. Many developers have said to us that kind of dollar figure is often the difference between viability or not viability. So we'll step in. We can't waive their infrastructure charges, although Moreton Bay City has done that for social housing. If we did that, then councils would be short on the funding they need for the infrastructure. So we can subsidise it for them for the right developments in the right places.
And Minister, in the Premier's speech, he flagged introducing a Queensland home finance loan pilot for regional Queensland. What will this involve and how many people will it help?
Yeah, this was a key ask from a number of regional mayors, and I know the LGRQ as well. We know that, unfortunately, a lot of regional Queenslanders can't get access to finance, and so expanding the eligibility by basically lifting the threshold means we will be able to help more people. This is a 2-year pilot, so we'll see how it goes, but it's ultimately about helping people get into home ownership in regional Queensland.
When will we start seeing that rolled out?
We'll try and get that rolled out as quickly as possible.
And Premier, how much responsibility do you take for the housing crisis in Queensland, given the Labor Party has been in power for the past 9 years?
Oh, look, I think I outlined how many of the trends that we're struggling with are global, caused by global events, and also that surge of population growth that we need to catch up with. And that's certainly what we're doing. It's what this plan is designed to do, deliver the housing and the infrastructure needed to meet that population growth. But you're right, I can't get Russia to pull out of the Ukraine. I can't bring peace to the Middle East, but we can work with the levers we have and the powers that we have and do the best we can.
Just on another issue, youth crime has been a major issue for the state government this term. There's been 2 major crackdowns. Twice your government has overridden the Human Rights Act in relation to children. Can we expect to see any further law changes before the election, or will you be taking any law changes to the election?
Look, what I've said is that we will consistently take the advice of the police, and if they need tougher laws, they'll get those laws. That's what we've consistently done. The murder that we saw at the weekend is nothing short of abhorrent, and we need to make sure the police have done a great job. We need to make sure that those offenders are caught and that the courts deal with them in the way that the community expects them to be dealt with.
So we could see more law changes between now and the October election?
Not that are under consideration right at this time, but I've consistently said that we will take the advice of the police and make sure they have the laws and the resources that they need. We're employing more police. I was criticised for those instances you referred to there. Rachel, some said it was too tough, but the community has to feel safe. And if that means being tougher on the violent repeat offenders, then we have to do that.
And I know you were asked about this yesterday, but yes or no, the LNP has repeatedly called on the state government to remove detention as a last resort. Can you categorically rule out you won't be adopting that policy?
Well, as I just said, we'll listen to our police and the experts, and we'll look at the evidence. And all of the evidence suggests that if you detain offenders for low-level offences, you expose them to hardened criminals, you expose them to gangs, you make it much more likely they will reoffend. So that LNP policy is incredibly dangerous. Not only would it be very expensive, you would need thousands, 2,500 more youth detention beds, and they would take significant time to build, but you'd actually make the situation worse. I've been criticised for saying that we need to use detention where it's required for community safety, but it should be a last resort. We should be preventing crime in the first instance. We should be intervening early to give our kids the best chance in life and a chance to get back on the straight and narrow. But where they fail, where prevention and intervention fail, that's where detention has a role, to keep the community safe from violent repeat offenders and to deliver the kinds of intensive programs that you can deliver in detention. So I think prevention, intervention, detention is how you're tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime.
I'll open it up to questions from the Queensland Press Gallery now.
Premier Josh Bavas from 9 News. Of course, as we've just been talking about, the murder of Vyleen White has been at the front and centre of many people's minds over the last few days. Her husband, Victor White, last night called all politicians jellyfish and said that youth crime laws in this state were as weak as water. How can Queenslanders feel like the state government is acting on youth crime and improving the situation when we do see instances like this?
Can I say at the outset, I completely understand how Victor is feeling. He's grieving, he's sad and angry, and I don't blame him for feeling that way. Anyone would. It's an awful crime, and it's still very raw. It's only in the last couple of days. What I know is that we are putting more police into the community, and that the laws we have in place are the laws that the police helped us craft. And if we need to do more, then we will do more. But nobody can seriously stand up and say they could have prevented this murder. I've heard some politicians go very close to saying that they'd guarantee they could have prevented this murder. That's a pretty incredible statement to be trying to make. Nobody anywhere in the world has eliminated all violent crime. But what we have is a plan to be tough and a plan to break the cycle of offending. And that is informed by the police, informed by the experts, informed by the evidence. And where the advice and the evidence says we should change our programs, we will. But you can't convince me that the best thing to do in the first instance is to prevent crime. And then intervene early where we can. And then the role of detention is where prevention and intervention have failed.
Premier, good afternoon. Hayden Johnson from the Courier Mail. Just following on from your comments there, we're told that right now there are 5 GPS trackers active on young offenders across Queensland. With the revolving door of alleged offenders securing bail, if police request you to expand those laws to increase the use of GPS trackers, will you introduce that immediately and the associated funding that goes with it?
I think I've already indicated, Hayden, that if the police ask for changes, I will of course consider them, and that's what we've always done. What you saw with that GPS trial is we introduced it at the same time as we toughened the sentencing and bail rules, and so some of the young offenders who prior to that would have been bailed and suitable for a GPS tracker, they're not getting bail now. They're being held on remand. And so that's why there has been a small number of people eligible for it, because those other laws have succeeded in keeping those offenders in detention. But of course, if there are ways we can make it more effective, we'll consider those.
Premier, Joel Dry from the 7 Network. Just a short time ago, a 16-year-old boy who was charged with stabbing to death a 70-year-old grandmother and stealing her car appeared in a children's court, and media was barred from being present despite applications. And this is a matter of law. It's the same story for most of his co-accused, journalists not allowed in to report to Queenslanders, not their identity, which should and will always be protected, but things like whether or not they were on bail at the time and whether they get bail for this recent crime. So will your government amend the law so that the fundamental tenet of open justice is reflected in the children's court?
My opinion, Joel, and this is not a, we haven't considered this as a government policy, but my opinion is that where reporters can be in those courts, I think magistrates should let them. And I think at the moment magistrates are erring too much on the side of not allowing journalists in. I can think of instances though where it's reasonable. You might have domestic violence issues, you might have child safety issues. I can see that there are reasons why magistrates should, on a case-by-case basis, be able to make that assessment, but I think they're making the assessment too often not to have reporters there, and I'd certainly look for ways to encourage magistrates to consider making the courts more open. I think that is good for scrutiny of our court processes, but also good for helping you do your job in translating to the community what happens in those courtrooms. So I'd certainly support that with the proviso that there would always be instances where it's not possible to have, or not appropriate to have reporters there.
Is it something you will ask the Attorney-General to look into?
I'm certainly happy in the first instance to talk to her about how we can change that magistrate behaviour, and then if that fails, I'm certainly happy to look further as well. I also know from talking to some of you that even where you are permitted, the process of knowing what's on where, finding the hearing, that kind of thing can be challenging too. And so I think there's also some work that can be done to facilitate your access beyond just whether you're allowed in a room or not.
Premier, Adam Walters from Sky News. The people of Ipswich and North Lakes in Brisbane's north would have noted that there wasn't a single reference to youth crime in your speech. Given...
It was a speech about housing.
It was, but given that the events of the weekend were so fresh, perhaps there might have been an expectation.
I figured I'd get a question.
Nonetheless, the absence of any reference to youth crime in your speech to the Queensland Media Club would have been noted by more than a few, including the people of those communities. Premier, I'm sure you concede the last 2 summers have been bookended by the murders of young mother Emma Lovell, and just 3 days ago, grandmother Vyleen White. Her daughter Denise has already been on the record to call for more conspicuous law enforcement. But how can you guarantee that before the next election, given the depletion of Queensland Police numbers?
Well, first of all, that's not accurate. There's 1,600 more police now than when we came to office. I understand, though, that from talking to people in Ipswich, that they don't feel safe going to the Redbank Plains town square right now, and I can understand that. They've said to me that as well as an increased police presence, they would like to see more security from the shopping centre, more CCTV, better lighting. I think they're all reasonable things for them to be asking for. We have a police beat there right now, making sure they do have that visible and physical presence right now. I spoke yesterday with Taylor, who's running that change.org petition calling for those extra security measures, and I'll certainly be talking to the police commissioner about those. So we're taking those concerns very, very seriously, and we want these communities to not just feel safe, but to be safe, and I know our police want that too.
Afternoon, Premier. Matt Dennien from Brisbane Times. We've been talking about the housing issue as a complex one and requiring a bunch of quite complex solutions. Many looking to the long term, but Minister Scanlon's spoken about some of the shorter term things that the government's trying to do to get around construction pressures with the use of modular homes and things like that as well. But beyond that, I guess we saw the Victorian Government's recent housing plan, housing statement, I think they called it, expanding the tax on vacant properties from Melbourne to a statewide tax to try and bring some of those properties back into use, I suppose. Is that something that your government has looked at all as part of this housing plan? And I suppose if so, what was the decision that was made on that and why?
I'm happy to get Meaghan to add to this, but everything that was raised at the Housing Roundtable and the summit was considered. What the advice to us was that there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that A, there is this big problem of vacant properties, and B, that taxing them would change owner behaviour. And so faced with that advice, it wasn't sensible to include in this package. But this is not the last thing we'll ever do on housing. And so if over time it emerges that there is, I'd love to discover that there's 500,000 houses out there that nobody's living in, but the evidence to us is that that's not the problem, and so that taxing those owners won't fix it.
Just to add to that, Premier, all I'd say is, as has been mentioned before, one of the barriers is the sort of yield at the moment. It is a challenging time in the sector, and so we're responding to those vacant properties by stepping in and providing that infill infrastructure relief. So we're hopeful to see more of those properties utilised by the development industry, but of course we'll continue to review that to see how it's operating.
Hello, Premier. Taryn Paris from the Urban Developer. I actually met you in about 2008 when you had your first crack at state politics. I was a local journalist on a little newspaper. My question is housing related, obviously being the urban developer. We've got a massive infrastructure pipeline in this state. We've got a hospitals big build. We've got a renewable energy plan. We're currently running the rule over the 2032 Olympic Games. You acknowledged that we've got a massive shortfall in labour. I think Infrastructure Australia mentioned it was about 131,000 shortfall in trades and labour this year. I guess I'm wondering, are we going to rationalise any of these big projects in our infrastructure pipeline in order to accommodate this big grand vision for 1 million homes? And secondly, would affordable build to rent and the expansion of the pilot projects be part of that consideration into the future? Thanks.
I'll let Meaghan talk about build to rent, but you're right, it's really challenging. And the challenge is, sometimes people characterise it as a choice between housing and infrastructure, but the problem is you need the infrastructure to get the housing. You need the roads and the public transport and the schools and the hospitals. So it's not binary. You can't choose one or the other. We need to find ways of doing both. There might be some opportunities for shaping the infrastructure program over time, and look, obviously that's something the Australian government's been looking at, but it's not as simple to say that we could stop building roads tomorrow and put all of those workers into building houses, because we need roads to get to the houses.
Yeah, and just in terms of build to rent, we obviously have changed some of those tax concessions to try and incentivise build to rent, so we're always keen to talk further. We also have the Housing Investment Fund and now the Housing Australia Future Fund, where we're very keen to work with developers and community housing providers to unlock more social and affordable housing. So I think you can see across government, both at a state level and federal government, our eagerness to work with everyone and anyone to build more supply.
Hello. Oh, there we go, it's on. Hi, Aidan Gillespie from The Guardian. Queensland neo-Nazis have latched on to this tragedy in Ipswich to further their own racist agenda. Are you concerned that some will exploit this tragedy to spread anti-immigration rhetoric and also to target the Queensland African community?
Oh, look, there's no place for that kind of response or racism in our state, and I would condemn it in the strongest possible terms. I welcomed the statement from African community leaders condemning the violence, and there's no place for this to be viewed through a racial lens.
Hello, Premier. Fraser Barton from Australian Associated Press. Thank you for your time today. One of your first directives when you became Premier was to revise the government's emissions targets from 30% up to 75% by 75% by 2035, so it's an 11-year period. Given Winchester South and Vulcan South coal mines are awaiting either EA's DESI approvals, federal government approvals, and Winchester's set to mine about 11 million tonnes of coal per year for 28 years, should it be approved. How feasible do you think these targets are should both of these mines be approved, these emissions targets? And will you legislate these emissions targets over the time as your Premier in the lead up to the election? And just a quick follow on that, should the opposition win the election, do you expect them to follow through with those emissions targets should they be legislated?
They're great questions. I'll take the middle one first. Yes, we will legislate them. We think that's important. We've heard from investors that having legislated targets give them confidence to invest, and so that's why we will do that. With regards to mining approvals, these targets relate to the emissions that we're accountable for under the global treaties, and so there will continue to be consideration of those projects, and they'll go through their environmental approval processes. Our focus is on the emissions that we are accountable for here in Queensland. There'll be an element of those mines that we are accountable for example, their diesel emissions and fugitive emissions, but otherwise the use of those resources will be accounted for in the places where they're used. The vast bulk of Queensland's coal is coking coal, I think about 75%. We don't have an alternative for steel making now. We will one day, but we need steel to make wind turbines and solar panels and batteries and all of the things we need for this transformation. So there'll continue to be a role for our resources industry. On the question of what the LNP will do, you'll need to ask them that, but I think that's one of the things that makes this election really critical. If you think about it, if we have these emissions targets legislated and we win a 4-year term, by 2028 we'll be on the pathway. You won't be able to turn it around. We will get to 75%. But if we are defeated, and should those laws be torn up, then we won't be on the pathway in 2028, and we will never meet the 2035 target, or indeed, it will be very, very hard. It will require serious jolts to get to net zero emissions by 2050. So the position they take on this legislation will be an indicator, the position they take to the election, but I think it underlines just what's at stake in October.
Just to follow up, will you then be trying to introduce and have that legislation for those targets passed before the October election?
That's our intention.
We have time for more questions.
Great. I've got one. Lydia Lynch from the Australian newspaper.
You let Lydia ask one?
Yeah, I went last. The Crime and Corruption Commission last year released a report into influencing practices in Queensland. The report recommended a number of reforms, but one of those reforms would be requiring union bosses to declare their meetings with the government when they seek to influence policy or law changes. And I note that we haven't seen a formal response from the government on that report yet. So given that the unions are big donors to the ALP and that you personally have faced criticism over your relationship with union bosses and their influence over your decision making, will you commit to implementing those reforms proposed by the Crime and Corruption Commission, or at least considering them?
We always consider everything that the CCC says. What I can tell you is that when I meet with union officials and where they are attempting to advocate for their members and influence government policy, that is disclosed in my diaries that are released each and every month.
So that report was, a year ago. Will we see a formal government response?
I'll have to check up on that for you, Lydia, but certainly happy to check up, and if we haven't responded, we will.
Any more questions?
Is that did Fraser have another one? Or Hayden?
Thanks. Still on, it's all right. We're an effective press gallery. Premier, the former Premier, Ms Palaszczuk, faced a little bit of criticism around taxpayer-funded polling. On Boxing Day, you said that you hadn't turned your mind to whether you continue that controversial contract. Given now, I think we're about a month on from that, have you turned your mind to it? How often are you polling? And are your decisions being based on whether polling comes back in the positive or the negative?
I'll confirm for you, Hayden, that we do attempt to make decisions based on what we think Queenslanders want. That's what I think Queenslanders would expect from us. If we continue that polling, we will publicly release it. I intend for it to be released to the Queensland Leaders Forum and publicly.
Sorry. If the we know that there's the review going into Olympic infrastructure. If that review recommends that the Gabba rebuild does not go ahead, where will the opening and closing ceremonies be for the Brisbane 2032 Olympics? They're not going to be held on the Gold Coast, are they?
I'll let Meaghan answer whether the Gold Coast should have a major event, but look, that's a big question, Lydia. If we don't have the Gabba, where can we do the opening ceremony, closing ceremony and athletics? And that's one of the things that Graham's going to have to consider in making his report. It's one of the reasons why every time previously I've asked this question, the answer has come back that there isn't an alternative, but I really hope that there is, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the report says.
Hello.
And the Gold Coast could totally host an opening ceremony if they wanted.
Hi again, Premier. This housing plan obviously focuses a lot on the levers that you have as a state government, I suppose. But you have spoken, and Minister Scanlon has as well spoken about how all levels of government and all stakeholders need to be kind of doing their bit. Given that, and I suppose your conversations that you're having with the Prime Minister around the construction workforce issue and other elements, do you feel like the federal government's doing enough with its levers, I suppose particularly around things like capital gains tax or negative gearing?
I'll get Meaghan to go to the detail of what they're trying to do, but what we've seen is that a lot of what they've tried to do has been thwarted in Parliament. You've seen both the LNP and the Greens political party attempting to block additional funding for housing, the shared equity scheme, which I think is really important. And so while I didn't want my speech to be too political, I was trying to call out the fact that if we had bipartisan support for these kinds of initiatives, they would be in place sooner and helping people to buy their own homes sooner. But Meaghan might want to talk about the programs.
Yeah, and look, we've got now the Housing Australia Future Fund from the federal government, so we're putting together a Team Queensland bid to make sure Queensland gets its fair share of funding. We also have the shared equity scheme that we think would help a significant amount of low to middle income earners. We are very much putting a position to the federal government in the lead up to our federal and state negotiations on the NAHA that we want to make sure that we get needs-based funding here in Queensland. Many of you will remember we had the National Rental Affordability Scheme that effectively is ending. We used to have the National Partnerships Agreement on Remote Indigenous Housing. A former government cut that. So we for a long time were not seeing the investment we needed from the federal government. It's really good to see some new initiatives, but we will continue to push for Queensland's fair share, particularly for funding for our specialist homelessness services and all of the support that we know that people in social housing need.
Premier, you're at the announcement for the PDA, the priority development area for the Gabba, which was set to add thousands of homes, some of them built for rent, social housing. Central to that was the redevelopment of the Gabba. So if you get your way, and it probably doesn't go ahead, are you worried that that's thousands of houses that don't enter into the pipeline?
No, I think we'll still see that kind of redevelopment in the Gabba PDA. It might be slightly different because of whatever the plan around the ground itself is, but the real enablers there are the train station and the bus interchange, the metro interchange. I think that's the game changer. The pedestrian interaction to the stadium and around the stadium is important, and we'll see what the suggestion is about it. I do think it's likely that we'll have some kind of maybe more like a renovation or a refurbishment than a redevelopment. And so that will still bring amenity and a venue that people will like to live close to. But Wollongabba's a great part of the town, really close to the city. It will have the best heavy rail and rapid metro transport, as well as great new pedestrian links. So I think everything is right there for it to still become the next South Bank.
Hi, just a quick one. I just wanted to know if you were looking into a ban on no grounds evictions for fixed term leases.
Thanks, Eden. I think it is. We did, as part of stage one, bring in some reforms. I acknowledge the sector wants those to go further. We'll always talk to the sector around law reform. I think you've seen that in the recent initiatives we've brought in. You'll see that we have closed the loophole too on that annual rent increase limit. We'll be attaching that to the property rather than the tenancy agreement, and I acknowledge the media for drawing that to our attention, but we want to make sure that whatever reforms we bring in are fair and balanced.
Michael McKenna.
Just trying to work. It's working. Michael McKenna from The Australian. Just interested about the Gabba. You seem to sign that you want an alternative to the rebuild of the Gabba, but isn't it so that you put the rebuild of the Gabba to Cabinet late last year? And can you tell us why the review? If you backed this rebuild, why the review? And how does Brisbane 2032 Olympics hold an Olympics without an Olympic stadium? And can the argument go beyond a stadium for the Olympics to a world-class stadium?
Well, I hope so. I mean, that was the promise of the new norms, was that we'd be building things that transformed the city, that delivered a real legacy, and the Olympics and Paralympics would be a stage on that journey. They would use those venues, but we wouldn't be building them for the Olympics. You're right, Michael, and I've never shied away from the fact that I was the minister assisting the Premier on the Olympics, Paralympics Games infrastructure. The team working on the Gabba was in my department. I've also said that throughout the process, I repeatedly asked what are the alternatives. I've previously released publicly the alternatives that were put to me, and none of those alternatives were very good. So it's entirely possible this review comes back and says that we have to go with that original plan. And if that is the outcome, I hope that that puts the division and bitterness and politics to one side and we can get on with building. But if there is an alternative, well, that's great news too, and we can consider that and hopefully have a better outcome. But I'll never be afraid to tell you that I've changed my mind or that I was wrong or that I've listened to Queenslanders, and that's what's happened here.
What was the change between your full-throated support for a rebuild to now? Can you tell us? Was it just base politics? What was it?
Well, I don't think I'd succeeded at convincing Queenslanders. And Queenslanders were saying to me, everywhere I went, that they thought there should be an alternative, that they didn't think that that was a good use of money in the context of housing shortages, cost of living, all of the other challenges. That's what they said to me. That's probably what changed between when it was first announced. I mean, not only did the budget increase, the anticipated cost increased, but we saw that big surge in inflation, which created those cost of living concerns. And so I think in the face of changed circumstances and feedback from the community, it's entirely appropriate for a leader to change their mind.
And just as a social tangential follow-up, just on, you've put housing at the forefront of the government's re-election. You're talking about 50,000 social houses to be built over the next 22 years. But in the term of your government, or that of Annastacia Palaszczuk, of which you were a central figure in the cabinet, you've only produced 5,000. You've been very good at explaining the current problems in meeting supply. So if you've only supplied 5,000 over nearly 10 years, why should voters believe that you're going to be able to reach that target, which I think it's 50,000 over 22 years, which equates to about 2,000 a year. So that's fourfold increase in housing, in public housing, when there's all these heightened pressures on supply, or obstacles in supply. So how can you reach a fourfold increase in public housing when you didn't reach it, didn't even come close to it when the problems weren't there? And has your government and that of the Palaszczuk government dropped the ball on public housing in the past 10 years?
So I'll get Meaghan to talk to our plans for achieving those targets of 2,000, in some cases more than 2,000 in a year. But what we have seen is an upward trend in the number delivered. So I think the average over that period is like 700 and we've got it closer to 1,200. So the trajectory is right. We need to keep increasing that increase to get to 2,000, and in some of those years we'll need to deliver more than 2,000.
Oh, and I'd just add to that and say this plan is ambitious. We make no apology for delivering what Queenslanders need. When you look back in the history of social housing in this state, we saw significant investment and increases in public housing, similar to the scale that we're proposing here during the GFC and during the nation building era. And so we want to get back there because we know that's what's needed here in Queensland. We are raising the bar. We know that more needs to be done. That's why we'll have an implementation task force. It's why we'll look at modular homes. But, you know, I've heard critics out there say that we shouldn't aim high. I don't think that's the answer. And frankly, the people who are saying we're aiming too high, what's the alternative? They're going to cut. We are going to deliver more public and community housing in this state because that's what's needed.